Hello, everyone. So, our topic for today is the key learning processes. So, we've already talked about the positive and the negative reinforcement. Today, we're going to talk about the types of reinforcers. So, we do have the secondary reinforcers and the primary reinforcers. When we talk about the primary reinforcers, they are very, very essential pertaining to our biological needs, you know. So they are very important basically. So, for instance, if we talk about food, that is actually fulfilling our basic biological need. These are our survival needs, you know. So, primary reinforcers are basically those. Coming to, of course, the secondary reinforcers, they do have the characteristics of a reinforcer pertaining to the kind of experience the organism has had with its environment. So they are also equally essential. If it is to do with, like, money, praise, appreciation, if it is, even grades, all these are basically secondary reinforcers. But again, they are also important to us, depending on the kind of experience that we've had with the environment, you know. Of course, then we do have the next topic, which is the extinction. Very, very important. So, here we have the extinction. So, extinction essentially is actually the disappearance of a learned response due to removal of the reinforcement from the situation in which the response used to occur. So, if we go back to both the forms of conditioning, if we go back to, let's say, the classical conditioning, so if you just imagine that, let's say, the dog actually elicits the response to salivate, which is actually on hearing the bell ringing. So basically, it's like the conditioned response that the dog is making to the conditioned stimuli, which is the bell. And upon that, there is no presentation of food, there is no food coming actually. And if this thing is actually prolonged and it continues to happen, of course, the learned response is going to disappear. It's going to weaken. Similarly, if we take example of the conditioning, of course, the other form of conditioning, which is of course the operant conditioning, and let's say the rat over there on pressing the lever does not get the food pellet. Now, if this also continues to happen time and again, of course, the learned behavior is going to weaken or it's going to eventually disappear, you know. So, that is what is extinction, you know. So, it is basically the weakening and the gradual disappearance of the behavior because, the reinforcement is withdrawn. The concerned animal is not being reinforced anymore, you know. So there is also something called as resistance to extinction, about which we had actually discussed in case of the determinants of operant conditioning. So basically, learning is something where you are actually becoming used to a behavior. You are becoming quite habitual to something. You know, so this learning also shows resistance to extinction. That learning of a behavior or a response has become so much a part of you that it's not actually easy to kind of completely extinguish or completely vanish that response or behavior from you. It does not disappear very quickly or immediately. The learned response or behavior, it does not extinguish immediately. So that is what is actually the resistance to extinction. So the learned response will not just extinguish immediately, or it will not just disappear immediately. There will be some resistance shown to actually the extinction of the learned response. So basically, even though the learned response, is not being reinforced now, but it would continue to occur for some time. Of course, whatever behavior you've learned, it will continue to occur for some time. Even if suppose you are not reinforcing the food pellet to the rat, still the rat will continue to show this behavior of pressing the lever for some time. Of course, you know It's not that, one day the rat did not get the food pellet, the next day he's not going to press the lever. Of course, the learned behavior will continue for some time. That is what essentially is the resistance to extinction. But what's important here to understand is that, with increasing number of trials, without reinforcement, the response strength gradually diminishes, and ultimately it will stop occurring. So if you keep on doing this again and again, definitely the learned response is going to diminish and gradually it might even disappear. So if you actually continue to stop reinforcing the rat time and again with every trial, you are not giving the food pellet to the rat. So a time will come that the rat will actually stop pressing the lever. That essentially is extinction. So now what's important here to understand is that how long, as a matter of fact, is the learned response going to show resistance to extinction? you know it actually depends on number of factors. So one is that, with increasing number of reinforced trials, the resistance to extinction also increases. you know and of course, the learned response has actually reached its highest level. And over here, it has actually established itself, you know. And after that, the number of trials will not actually make a difference in the response strength, because now the response has actually, or the learned behavior has actually established itself fully, you know. And now the number of trials, essentially, whether more or less, are not going to really make a difference, to the strength of the learned behavior. You know. Now, the second is that the resistance to extinction increases, you know, with increasing number of reinforcements during the acquisition trials. You know, and if beyond that there is any increase in the number of reinforcement, then the resistance to extinction is going to reduce. You know. Also, what's important to understand over here is that if we go back to, let's say, the classical conditioning, where we talked about the delayed form of conditioning, which comes under the forward conditioning. So delayed conditioning is also going to actually increase the resistance to extinction, because that's the best form of conditioning, essentially. you know because in trace conditioning there is a lot of time gap. you know so anyway, the delayed conditioning is the best form of conditioning. you know and if we talk about, uh, like partial reinforcement, or we talk about the intermittent reinforcement, they are also going to show greater resistance to extinction. you know because essentially, if we come to see, if there is going to be like a irregular way of reinforcement, sometimes you're reinforcing, sometimes you're not, it's going to actually keep up that kind of excitement, and it's going to continue to make the organism very hopeful. So if sometimes you reinforce the rat with the food pellet and the next time you don't, and then the third time you again reinforce, the fourth time the rat is going to be eager enough. The rat is going to have the hope that I'm going to be reinforced yet again. So the learned response is not going to actually extinguish very quickly. Definitely, it is going to show a greater resistance to the learned behavior or response. That means there is going to be a greater resistance to extinction, in case of any intermittent or partial reinforcement, you know, other than, the continuous reinforcement, So in partial or intermittent reinforcement, the, uh, you know, there is a greater resistance to extinction than the continuous reinforcement, which we've already discussed before. Then, of course, coming to the next slide, we do have something called as the generalization, and we have the discrimination. you know so generalization, actually is, if we just take example, let's say, uh, you were actually, let's say, um, trying to condition the dog, you know, to the bell, to the sound of the bell, and you actually gave the dog n number of trials. And whenever you actually um, rung the bell, you gave the food to the dog. And with just the sound of the bell, the dog started to salivate. Now, instead of the sound of the bell, of course, there is going to be a sound only. But now that the conditioning has already been established, the dog has learned this new behavior that whenever the bell will be made to ring, the food will come. And with just the ringing of the bell, the dog salivates. Now the conditioning has been established. Now, let's say there is another very similar kind of a stimulus with that of the conditioned stimuli. So instead of the bell, let's say there is a ringing of a telephone, that is presented, you know. So, of course, the organism makes the conditioned response to that also, you know. So, this phenomena of responding similarly to a similar kind of a stimuli is known as generalization. So, then when we talk about, let's say, discrimination, this is basically generalization. We know it is due to similarity, and discrimination we come to see is a response that you tend to make due to difference. Whenever there is a difference, you tend to make a response then. That is what is discrimination. So suppose you're trying to make a child feel very fearful, you know, and you've started talking about a man, that, there is a man, who's got a mustache and he wears black clothes. Beware of this man. You're trying to scare this little child, you know. And of course, whenever the child is going to see such kind of a personality, because he's actually been able to picture this person in mind, that this man has got a mustache and he's actually got he's been wearing black clothes. So whenever he sees this kind of a man, he actually tends to show signs of fear, you know. So now the fear is quite generalized, you know. It's actually a generalized fear here, because with a similar kind of stimuli, he's eliciting this response of fear. Now, basically, whenever the child is going to meet a stranger who is wearing some other color clothes, and is completely different to look at, you know, he is not going to show any fear, and that is what is discrimination, you know. This is what is discrimination. So, occurrence of generalization actually means the failure of discrimination, you know. So, coming to the last slide, we do have the last one, which is the spontaneous recovery. Very, very important. So, spontaneous recovery actually occurs after a response, a learned response to be more specific, has actually extinguished. It has actually completely disappeared, you know. So, spontaneous recovery occurs after that, Now, how does that happen? You know, so let's just take an example. Let's just think of an example of, again, the same experiment, which is the classical conditioning. So imagine that you are making use of this particular experiment, or this form of conditioning, which is classical conditioning, and you're trying to train your dog to expect food whenever he hears the ring of a bell, you know. So whenever you ring the bell, your dog comes running to the kitchen and just actually sits next to the food bowl, you know. Now, after the response has actually been learned, or it has actually been conditioned to, or the dog has actually become very habitual, to making this response, you have now stopped presenting the food after the ringing of the bell. So literally when you ring the bell, the dog comes and sits next to the food bowl, but there's no food given. And this you are doing after the dog has actually become very habitual to it, or the dog has actually been conditioned to it, or has actually become very used to this behavior. Now, over the period of time, the response becomes extinguished, means the response has actually completely disappeared. And now your dog is not responding to the sound of the bell. No? You have stopped ringing the bell now. You are not ringing the bell. You have stopped this entire procedure of ringing the bell, etc. Because as it is, the dog has stopped responding also. So you've stopped this entire procedure. But after a couple of days, you decided that you're going to ring the bell again. So, what's going to happen? Your dog is going to come rushing into the same room and is going to sit by the same bowl and is going to wait for the food. That is what is spontaneous recovery. You know, this is what is happening in case of spontaneous recovery. You know, but what's important here to understand is that the amount of spontaneous recovery essentially depends on the duration of time lapsed after the extinction session. So it's been found that the longer is the duration of time lapsed, the greater is the recovery of the learned response. That is what essentially is the spontaneous recovery, you know. So many times this question also comes to mind that, the response, whatever was learned, has it actually completely extinguished, you know? And is it that it's not going to occur ever again, even if we try and present the conditioned stimuli, you know? So basically, it was found that, after lapse of considerable time, whatever response that has been learned, you know, or you can say the conditioned response, it actually recovers. It recovers and it will occur to the conditioned stimuli, you know. So that means the response that was learned, it does not really extinguish forever. So whenever after a good considerable amount of time, because if the time lapse is greater is going to be the uh, spontaneous recovery. You know, so that essentially is what we are trying to understand here, the spontaneous recovery. And I have explained you with the help of an example where we talked about the dog. We talked about the classical conditioning, but in a different way. Normally also at home, we've noticed this process many a times. So this was all about the key learning processes. Thank you so much.